Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. I'm Al Horner, and on today's show, a question for you. Is the spirit of the Blitz, that phrase that we hear all the time in the UK, that's become one of the pillars of British self-identity in 2024, actually kind of a lie? We hear about this idea of ordinary people coming together in collective resilience during World War II so frequently in this country. It's something invoked by UK politicians often, an idea that looms large and defines what we should be. But it might just be a myth, according to an astonishing new historical drama from the revered British artist Steve McQueen, my guest this week. Steve's incredible new film, Blitz, forefronts the experiences of people of colour and other marginalised communities during the notorious London bombings of the Second World War, people who found themselves excluded from the much mythologised togetherness, often with violent force. Instead of the stiff upper lip that Britain has since proudly woven into its self-image, Blitz teases a more feral reality about who we were back then, with people stampeding over each other for shelter, opportunistic criminals robbing the dead, and sex on the tube tracks of Stepney Green Underground Station. It is such a powerful film from an incredibly powerful filmmaker. You'll of course know Steve for his work on 12 Years a Slave, 2008's Hunger, the erotic psychosexual drama Shame, and his crime thriller Widows, not to mention his TV series Small Axe. With an Oscar, 2 BAFTAs, a Golden Globe, and a knighthood to his name, Steve, or Sir Steve to give him his full name, is something of a British treasure, so you can imagine what an honour it was to have this conversation, delving into a movie that does things that we simply haven't seen before in a World War II movie. In the spoiler conversation you're about to hear, we get into the storybook-like construction of this film, which unfolds in these Pinocchio-esque episodes, tiny vignettes that give us glimpses into the lives of all these different characters living out their own stories in this strange time in British history. We talk about how COVID-19, another moment of supposed collective resilience in the face of hardship, may or may not have influenced his script, and of course break down the enigmatic words with which this film ends, Make a Wish. A massive thank you to Steve for being a brilliant guest, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters without whom this show would not be possible. If you like what we do on Script Apart and you'd like to get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and the opportunity to join us every Friday on Zoom in our weekly writing hour, well, all you need to do is head to patreon.com/scriptapart, where you can sign up for the price of a monthly cup of coffee. That address one more time is patreon.com/scriptapart. If you'd like to support the show in other ways, we love to read your posts on social media, we love to read your reviews. All of these word of mouth things really do help the show grow and help keep the lights on at Script Apart HQ. So yeah, please consider doing that if you would like to. Okay, that's all the admin out of the way. Let's jump in. This is the incredible Sir Steve McQueen discussing the first draft secrets of Blitz. Thank you so much everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner. This episode was produced, as ever, by Camille Demek. I hope you enjoy the show. Steve, what an absolute privilege to meet you. Congratulations on Blitz, which is a movie that unpicks a certain myth, one that's become so ingrained in British self-identity. Why tackle that myth, Steve? Is it simply a case of correcting the historical record, or is there something urgent about what the myth has mutated into today that you wanted to address?
Well, first and foremost, I just wanted to sort of steep myself in research about that particular period, because what's interesting about often what you think you know is often different to what actually happened. And just by doing a lot of sort of shallow, deep sort of mining even, you sort of come across things which are very how can I say, evident in today's sort of landscape. and in the fact of how London was, as my historical advisor, Joshua Levine, who wrote the book Secret History of the Blitz, says London, central London was, incredibly, diverse, and he, as his words were, a cosmopolitan. There was a large Chinese community here. There was, a black community here. There was an Asian community. There were 3 black clubs off 7 dials near the Donmar Theatre. It was really, this landscape was very different to how we assumed, have been shown to believe. So my reference, I never looked at a war movie because that was of no interest to me, but it was about the research and digging deep in the research within Pro-War Museum and other researchers, because I knew I had to get a landscape in order to sort of make I knew that I had the basis of the landscape to make my film. And it was just like, it was so rich and so dynamic and so kind of exciting that for me, it was like, oh my gosh, how come this has never been seen in cinema before? Obviously, we talked about this sort of diverse sort of center of London, but also about sort of what the women did. And again, during that time, it was just exciting. It was like a science fiction movie in a way, because it was a world that I never knew about, but just was real and happened.
Yeah, you mentioned Joshua Levine there, who, as you said, was a consultant on the film. His book, there's so much in it that surprised me. For example, like, one thing I had no idea about was like the eruption of sex and carnality, and in particular like homosexuality in the Blitz. He writes that the Blitz brought homosexuality closer to the surface of British society than it had ever been before. There is so much detail. There is so much of the Blitz that is kind of excluded from the public narrative of that time, that when you sat down to write this, it must have been hard to work out what to include versus what to kind of like maybe have occupy the fringes of the frame to allude to. Like, how did you work out the scope of the film and what was going to be the focus?
The focus had to be love. The focus had to be the family. The focus had to be what I was interested in the first place. This photograph of this black child, this black boy who was going to be evacuated, little suitcase, cap, winter's coat. He was standing on a platform. I discovered this image when I was doing research for Small Axe, the still morphology I did. And when I saw that image, I knew that was my in. And everything has to serve the story of Rita and his mother, and George, who, say the little boy who gets evacuated. So from that image, I sort of circled around who was his mother, where did he live, his grandfather, why his grandfather's a widow. So from that moment, just circling out and spiraling out to sort of, the landscape. So everything they had to serve that story, really. I mean, it's great to do all this research and to get the sort of idea of what the landscape was and all these amazing things that happened, the sexual things that you talked about and whatnot, but it had to serve the story. And if it was not of interest for helping this child's journey, then it had to come out. But what was interesting, the device that I used in a way was to sort of have almost like a clean sheet with this boy, his innocence, going through the landscape and having these moments with characters or situations. So we get, as he tries to make his way home. That was my sort of strategy in some ways of getting some kind of idea of what was going on, because you get glimpses of clips of life and things as he tries to make his way home. I thought that was a great idea. It's just within his odyssey, he has these encounters.
Yeah, it is like, as a film, it's a brilliant addition to this very eclectic body of work that you have, Steve. But there's one kind of commonality that you've described running through all of it, a sensitivity, as you've described it, to the world we're living in. I'm interested in not putting into the fore the things that we want ourselves to be, and rather the things we are, which is a really interesting phrase. And I think going back to that idea of kind of correcting the myth around the Blitz, this film does strike me as very in keeping with your other movies, in that it's about who we are rather than the fantasy that we sometimes perpetuate as a culture, as a British culture. But before we get into some of the ways this movie maybe marks a departure for you, Steve, what are some of the ways in which Blitz feels like a continuation of other stories that you've told?
Well, I don't think it makes a departure from what I do at all, because each individual subject is what it needs to be. I never bring my stencil and plant it over a subject matter. The subject matter has to tell me what it wants, what it needs. I'm there to facilitate what the subject needs. So it's about I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a situation where I put my style on something. I'm not. That's of no interest. That doesn't. that, one, you said, obviously my work is so sort of different from one another, whatever it was, eclectic, you used the word. Well, that's normal because it's about the work. It's not about me. Take me out of it. It's WORK. And it's important that, as an artist, you can remove yourself personally from something and actually serve the subject matter in the best way you think possible. So it's not about oh, he or she does something in a certain way. It's about the subject. Subject has to be first and foremost. But you, as an artist, you as a filmmaker, have to serve it. That's interesting because it pushes you. It feeds you. It becomes, there's a dynamism about it. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I want. And it coming from, if it's Hunger with Bobby Sands, all the way through to Blitz or 12 Years or Shame or whatever it is, Widows or whatever. It's about how you approach something in the best way it needs to be. If that makes any sense. And again, forgive me, just you jumped in there about the sort of homosexuality and or sex in general during the Blitz. When people thought they were going to die, it was like a free for all. Well, let's get on with it. I mean, we know about Quentin Crisp and his stories of his escapades during the Blitz and during the war. I mean, times that by 100 of what was going on. We have, in the movie, you have the guy called Snake Johnson, who was the conductor at the Café de Paris, who based himself off Duke Ellington, an openly gay black man. Again, he was involved with a well-to-do white guy. Again, it is about that, liberation. So much liberation happened during the Blitz. Women sort of, went to work for the first time in en masse and understood the whole idea of union, of whole idea of, again, these groups, people with groups having power. That's why, after the war, church was voted out because people didn't want to go back to where they were. People were doing things they never thought they would be doing, and they found their liberty within that particular period. I mean, it's a very interesting. And also, we talk about race within. Listen, it's in that particular period as well, but also now. I mean, just the other day with fascists marching in central London. This summer we had race riots. Everything which is going on, unfortunately, with Ukraine, Sudan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, so forth. All these things are to do with race. So this is not just a thing, is Steve McQueen doing something about race? Yeah, we could. It's all to do with race. It's all to do with race, and not just fighting so-called our enemies, but ourselves. And that's what's going on now. So there's so many things which sort of are in this picture, which sort of amplify which is going on now. So one could say that this, of course, we're engaged in a story about 1940, but we could talk about, what's going on in 2024. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating to me. Like, obviously, the story is about a child who wouldn't be partaking in sort of like the hedonism and some of the kind of like feral behavior almost that the Blitz was kind of sparking in people who really did think it was the end of days. But you kind of fill the fringes of the film with little moments that kind of allude to that apocalyptic madness, like the couple having sex on the tube tracks and things like that. There are all sorts of details like that just make it so rich. I do want to go back though, Steve, to just what you were describing. That sounded like such a beautifully egoless way to view what you do. This idea of just listening to what the work demands of you. What were the things that this particular story demanded of you that pushed you out of your comfort zone as a storyteller? There must have been things that this story was requiring from you that weren't kind of avenues you'd explored before in your work.
Well, I love the idea of love. I think you got to an age where you realize the only thing worth living for, the only thing worth dying for is love. When you ask yourself all these kind of crazy questions, and then you confront yourself as things which are going on in the world and what you're control of, and most of the things what are happening around us, unfortunately, is not in our control. And it's about focusing on what is in our control and how we can make ourselves better in a way. I mean, I'm just talking about just trying to be healthy as an individual, and love is it. It's the only thing we've got. And I love the idea of this love between Rita and her son, George, and him wanting to, go back to that nest. Because as soon as he leaves that nest, he realizes that, the world isn't that great. Well, they're not great to him. And in some ways, again, using George as our vessel to see the world is very interesting because, again, he's a child, therefore we kind of refocus our adult gaze through his and see things differently. It's like when you have I have a child. I remember I have two children, but when it was small, I remember my daughter giving me a leaf to look at. I thought, okay, it's a leaf. And then I go, oh my God, look, it's a leaf. It's, oh, look at the leaf. You refocus your gaze again through a child's eyes. You see a leaf again for the first time almost. So again, seeing the world through George's eyes almost for the first time. Again, it takes the structure of almost like a Brothers Grimm fairy tale in a way. And there's a classical sort of narrative which is going on there, but actually doing things completely different. I mean, every image in this picture is revolutionary because it's never been seen before. Everything. I mean, no one's ever seen images like this. I mean, just because, and it's kind of fascinating to me because, therefore you understand it's been a choice how things have been portrayed or how things have been viewed upon. And again, I always equate it to cowboys and Indians, and you find out that the Native Americans aren't the bad guys after all. I mean, how many decades of film has, one of the first silent pictures have been about, cowboys, and even cowboys weren't white. They were black. So, even The Searchers, the famous film The Searchers, is based on a black man trying to find his wife. So again, how history can be traversed in a way for certain people's advantage. What was so exciting for me was to put this on film and to a situation where people could be brought into a situation which is modern in a way, which is obviously of the past, but in some ways of now. Very, very important. I don't know if that's answered your question, actually.
No, it answered it beautifully, and it set up a question I was really curious to ask in terms of the now. This is a film about, this era of supposed collective stoicism that follows what was supposed to be a moment of British collective stoicism in terms of our response to COVID. How did that period coincide with the work? Did it influence it at all? And what observations do you have, if any, from that moment about who we are now versus who we perhaps were then as a people?
Well, I think in the sense of what the Second World War, trauma. I think that there's been trauma handed down through the generations. Keep calm and carry on. Again, step up a lip, all that. It's held a lot of things in, and you can see the evidence of that. Through certain people's behavior, going down generations. Unfortunately, I think obviously the same will and has happened with COVID, but also what COVID gave me was a chance to write the screenplay on my own, because usually I direct two and two and a half things going. I would be co-writing, this is the first time I actually sat down with myself. And I think, I'm dyslexic, so the fact that I could focus on that time, use that time to really hone down on just focusing on actually writing, it was the advantage to me in a way. And it was a great period. It was wonderful. It was exciting to hear things and to read things and to do the research and to get further in, really. Yeah. And at that time I was finishing off small acts as well during that time as well. So it was the two things going on at the same time still, but I could really get on with my writing and dictate things and on dictaphones and translate things through my assistant and so forth and whatnot. So it's very, very exciting, very exciting.
I can imagine. We should talk about George. As a character, there is this vulnerability to him, there's this defiance to him, there's a fight to him, and that all makes him feel so real. But at the same time, he's kind of quiet enough to become, as you aptly described him in this conversation with Barry Jenkins, as kind of a mirror for the audience. Like, we see our own childhoods in him, our own innocence. I'm curious how you kind of approached treading that line, Steve, like how you crafted George, and what the kind of considerations were, almost practically as well, because you're working with a very gifted child actor, amazingly gifted child actor, but I've never written a child character myself. What were some of the considerations that fed into who you wanted this character to be and that mirror that you wanted to provide the audience?
Well, Elliot, finding Elliot was very key, because you write something and think, oh my God, does George exist? And Elliot gave me so much more than what was on the page, because again, you're dealing with someone he's never acted before. He's a child. I didn't know what he was, but he wasn't an actor And he wasn't even ready, I imagine, when he came on the screen, but he progressed as he was there, because he's a case of, he reacts to certain things. He's real. There's a reaction. There's no pretending with him. He's real. He's extremely professional. He's constant. The one thing about his concentration is amazing. So when he reads action, then he's there. He's there. He could actually play, and for him, it's for reals, as it were. So what was beautiful about it is he's soaking. He's a sponge. What children they do is they soak things, and they don't say too much. He's not a child actor where they sort of becomes the mannerisms become so adult. No, he's actually a child. And that was so fascinating for me to sort of enhance and to sort of discover, because the script is a script is a script, meaning that script is just to get the cameras rolling. Then from there you're right, because I'm not a cartoonist, I'm not an illustrator, I'm a filmmaker. So the script is there to sort of is a leaping board, and then you sort of he added so much to the emotion of it, and him and Serge's relationship was so beautiful, so real. The mutual appreciation was extraordinary. So therefore, what you had there was a lot of improvisation between the two, because it was fantastic. And Paul Weller, and Paul came into the equation as well, because Paul, what was interesting about Paul is Paul has 8 children. His first 2 children are black. He's mixed race. So he understood when George went into the world, and he says, and don't stand up to bullets, and all pants, no trousers. He understood when he's left his house that as a black child, there'll be dangers, more dangers than he could, and he can't protect him. So that you see his face. So that is real for Paul. He understood that. And also as Paul is an amazing actor too, who knew. But again, I just had the faith that he could pull off that, because he has a depth and that weight and that gravitas that we needed in the picture. Of course, and obviously when people see the picture, they'll understand why. That was innate with him, because there's a stillness in him. He's like a silent movie star. You want to know what he's thinking. You want to know his experience. When those kids call him a black bastard, you feel how it cuts him in half. You see on his face that silence. That's what we talk about. Look at his face. It's heavy. I mean, George Hemingway in our picture. We have a 9-minute scene with George Graham's character, and he's not Oliver Twist. There's nothing Dickens about him, because he's not. How people see Oliver Twist is very different how they see George Hemingway. He's black. What people project on him. He's black. How he sees an apple. He's black. How people see me before I walk into a space or project on the way. It's a different. It's a disservice. It's kind of it's storytelling. There's a complexity to it. Even Stephen Graham, who has a black father, it's complex. It's not, this sort of cuteness or sort of some kind of in a sense of way how people see him. People see him as, if you see the picture, the only people who actually see George are other black people, other people of color, or authorities. And how an authority sees him is very different how they would see a blonde hair, blue-eyed Oliver Twist. So it's more complex or more complicated than that. It's there's a graveness to it. Absolutely. There's no if, but, maybe. And again, I reflect on what's going on in the world right now as far as race is concerned. It's all about that. Tell me it's not.
And one of the beautiful threads of this film is seeing the inner journey that George goes on alongside his physical journey in coming to accept that blackness and find a peace and a beauty. Can you tell me how that sort of element of the film came together, and how the air raid warden Ife was kind of integral to that? It's such an incredible scene where George finds himself in the Empire Arcade, looking at all these images of British Empire that are held up with this kind of pride. And it's a warfare akin to the warfare that Britain is supposed to be defending itself from. There's so much going on in those scenes and in that moment. Can you take me through where that all came from, Steve?
Well, it's myth upon myth. You know what I mean? Blitz, Empire, the cost. So what happened with that scene is interesting. So the script was a script, so we got the script. And then Adam Somner, who was my first AD, was extraordinary. He's like the George Harrison of the film world. And he's worked with Scorsese, Spielberg, Paul T. Anderson. He's this kind of guy. And Ridley Scott. There's a guy. He's always there. again, he's one of these people. I'm going on a bit. If George doesn't take the Beatles to India, what happens to the Beatles? And that's Adam Sommer, and also Adam Stockhausen. So the dynamic duo were in Hull, because one of the places we were shooting in Hull. So the two Adams were there, Stockhausen and Sommer were there, and they came across this old arcade, but it was very disheveled and it was like secondhand bookstore. Most of it is empty, whatever. And as soon as they said, Steve, we got this location range, we thought it may be interesting to you, this location, this arcade. And as soon as they showed me the arcade, I knew what to do, because the Empire Arcade wasn't written until they found that location. So as soon as they found that location, I go, I know what to do. So I started to write that because we had to read the script. So, okay, no, we do this. So sometimes how that comes about, it's sort of the tail before the head, and that's how that came about. But it was interesting as far as Ife is concerned, because Ife is based on a real life warden, a real airway warden called Ite Epion, who was a law student working in the Marylebone area as an as an air warden. And that speech that Ife does in the shelter about because people are trying to divide the shelter through race. That was a speech he does in it. Hopefully, if anyone hasn't seen it, the speech he gives in the air raid shelter is a speech that actually happened, and that could be said today, verbatim. And the whole idea of George, in some also, this is what happened. So there's a very important part in the film when George sort of embraces his blackness with Ife. That happened on the day. I thought, okay, well, that wasn't in the script. Him confirming his blackness, that happened on the desk. Okay, no, this is what you're gonna say, and that was it. So then I had it. Okay, no, this is. I just put it in his mouth, and that was it. And it was beautiful because, yeah, that embrace and everything else was quite magical. So I'm not saying as much as I can, because obviously if people haven't seen the picture, hopefully you'll come back to this and you'll understand what I'm saying.
Oh, it's okay. This is a spoiler podcast, Steve, so it will be going out after the release of the film, and there'll be a big spoiler warning. So yes,
he embraces he embraces him. And he calls Ife back and says, "I am black," and it's embrace, and it's beautiful. And I said to Benjamin at the time, hug him as if your life depended on it. It was just it's such a beautiful thing. Yeah.
And of course, I mean, there's poignancy to that phrase you just used there, because of course, moments later, we find out that of course Ife did lose his life, and it's so heartbreaking to see this kind of relationship bloom, and this acceptance of George's race with that, and then for it to be taken away so abruptly.
It's like love. It's like life, huh?
Yeah.
And it's like the sort of love situation with Rita, the character love interest, played by Harris Dickinson. Love gets cut off. A casualty of war. That doesn't develop. There's a sort of affection, but it doesn't develop because war. Things get cut in half. Again, I think that's a part of the narrative, that before things get started, they could get cut off.
We should talk about Rita, who is a fantastic character, and also kind of an interesting inroad into another part of British life during the Brits that is kind of, it's been massaged into one thing by myth over the years, but in actual fact, it was something else. Like George's mother, Rita, and the women that she works with, they have this rebellion to them. They have this sexual agency to themselves. They're not just kind of sitting and waiting for their beaux to come back from the front lines. They're living their lives during this period. And they're also kind of advocating for safety. Like there's this great moment during Rita's performance on the radio where her friends storm the stage to demand that the government opens the tube stops as bomb shelters. Can you tell me about forging Rita, obviously as her own character, who is a human being first and foremost on the page, but also as a vehicle to explore these parts of British female life during the Blitz that, again, have been kind of excluded from the narrative around the Blitz?
Well, again, I just wanted to delve into the realities of what was going on then, and give that a platform, because it's like I said, it's half of the war effort. Half of the war effort is women holding stuff together, the emotional and physical backbone of the country. And we need to understand that, when these guys came back home with, post-distress disorder, there was the women who had to sort of, pull shit to keep shit together, as well as what they were doing before that. dealing with their aging parents and their children off the war and working in the ammunitions factory or their aircraft hangar, wherever they were doing. It was so interesting to look at and so dynamic. I'm not just ticking boxes here. I'm not, okay, let's give the women a space. No, because it was so fascinating in a way what they were doing. I mean, the assembling the bomb scene. I mean, it's this, but at the same time, sheltering from bombs that are falling, the perversity of that. Again, I think it's kind of this half of the story which hasn't been really kind of looked at, and I think also again demonstrating it against sort of just to get into shelters, just to be sheltered from the bombs. It's very simple, but it's actually at the same time there's a power in that, and I think with someone like Saoirse Ronan is just extraordinary actor, whatever you want to say. To give her the tools to sort of portray that was just a privilege.
I should ask as well, Steve, about the first draft. You alluded earlier to kind of almost approaching it as like a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, and there's certainly that kind of episodic nature to the film in which George, once he's separated from Rita, is encountering all these different people that lend the film these kind of vignettes that are glimpses into the lives of other people having their own stories during the Blitz. You could take any of these characters like Jess or Ruby, and they could almost have their own full film about their experience of it. So tell me about like the first draft and whether that structure was always baked in. Was it always the case?
That structure was always baked in, as it were. Yeah, because I just love the glimpse of life. So you get an idea, so you get a part of their lives. But the real heart of it was the kid, because that you had a situation where you wanted that kid you want that kid to get home. And again, the vulnerability of a child in wartime, it's so vulnerable. Just like seeing that photograph. I mean, I just wanted to hug that child when I saw that photograph. I thought his vulnerability would be our sort of, our kind of hook. And of course, he's moving through, and there's some great characters you see or whatever, and you're going to think of what happened to them in the end, or what had become of them or whatever. But but then you can move on to the next, because the other ones will be as interesting or fascinating or whatever. And maybe they'll be favorites for people, but at the same time, you're with the kid trying to get home, and it's chaos. It's chaos. So with the chaos come glimpses of life and things which are never developed. I mean, again, casualties of war like Tommy, who gets sort of, again, killed by a train coming in the opposite direction. That's a casualty of war. People weren't just killed or by bombs falling on the head, just like the fire hose in the beginning of the picture. The inadequacy of the sort of the equipment that they had, canvas hose pipes, leaking. Again, he couldn't control the water pressure. All these details which one discovers and what was going on then. These are all casualties of war. And therefore, to have that structure for me was kind of that glimpse of life was exciting, because you could show so much, but not having to stay and move on, because the heart and soul of the picture was George and Rita.
And as we talked about at the beginning, in terms of Joshua's book and the infinite nature of the different stories of people who lived through this time, you must have had so much to pick from in terms of the characters who you could have George encounter. Were there any kind of different little vignettes that you almost put in the film that existed perhaps in an outline or in that first draft, or was it always these characters?
In an outline, but an outline for sure. But you have to, again, you're talking about script set, you're going to take them out, because it's all about the kid. Focus on the kid. When in doubt, focus on the kid. Focus on the mother. Focus on those two. Focus on those two magnets needing to sort of reunite, because it has to serve this. It has to serve the story. No matter how things are fascinating to you. Some great image stuff I had, and okay, we'll check that out now, because I think again, killing your darlings is the first thing you have to learn as a screenwriter. That's the first thing. Absolutely, kill your darlings. Things like that. It doesn't. It's not good enough. It doesn't help us to push the story along. It doesn't help to push the story along, because it becomes a fascination. And fascination is not a story.
In terms of pushing the story forward, though, it is interesting. Like the film, because it takes place over quite a short period of time. Like it has this momentum, but what sometimes kind of punctuates that momentum are these moments of music that are so beautiful. Like obviously, I mentioned Rita's kind of performance singing on the radio. There's the family sing along at the piano. There's the moment where Ife and George sing Hallelujah together. You begin to see how music must have been a refuge for people in that time and in that situation. Can I just ask you about that? And like your insistence upon putting these moments in the film, even though like they slow the pace down, but they do it for a reason. They have such a purpose.
You try to intertwine these things, which doesn't, again, it gives you ethos. It gives you a certain kind of what was going on at the time, because it's not about slowing it down. It's actually about putting you in the moment, what people was going on, and propel you in a way, because music was just as important as mask in those days, because it was about what could save you in the sense of lull you, what could corral you. That was what music was such an important part, integral part of that time. And to work with this kind of a dynamic duo of Hans Zimmer, just does a score, and Nicholas Britell, who did the on-screen music. This is the same dynamic duo that worked on 12 Years a Slave. I thought, okay, well, let's go back to that. It was very interesting. And also to write a song like Winter's Coat with Nicholas, which is actually was about my father. You know, he left leaving his winter coat. The whole idea of an embrace, an absence. But when you put on the coat, it becomes like an embrace, and everyone has some keepsake of someone, in a way, who passed in that factory. When we were singing in that factory, so everyone could alert to that, so the emotions came through. I mean, it's very, people like Verlin and the others, and were very, very important. Very, very important in that time to sort of to console, but also, I think, and also music that we could sort of rave to as well, like in the Café de Paris or in the club before the war with Marcus and Rita. It was about living as well as much as anything else, because everyone thought they could die at any moment. So life became even more. It's like Prince, party like it's 1999. So it's integral to the narrative, really.
I love the opening scene, Steve. You've described being quite shocked during your research process at the futility of trying to contain the flames, the fires from these aerial bombardments with equipment that you described as leaving these firefighters fighting a fire-breathing dragon with a water pistol. What I love about that opening is I think there's a temptation to see World War II as a quainter version next to the terror of the warfare of today, but that scene is so visceral, and it immediately puts you into the almost literal hellscape of London during that time. Can you tell me about like your decision to open the film this way, and whether there were ever any other openings that you considered, or whether it felt right as a kind of as a means of setting the tone for what was to come?
I just wanted to get right into it. Blitz, as I said, is the title. Let's get into it. Let's not play. Let's not jump around the edges. Boom, dive in. But also at the same time, it was again, it was very deliberate that I wanted a situation where, we were not just fighting enemies, we were fighting ourselves. So therefore, the whole idea of this sort of spitting serpent that's out of control, and sort of corral this thing, having to sort of wrestle this sort of hose as a spitting serpent, was very much important to me, that we were fighting ourselves as much as fighting enemy, because it's a metaphor for what happens in the rest of the movie. In a way, what war entails, again, and it's heavy. It's just like what's going on now. We are fighting ourselves more than anything else. I mean, like I said, what's going on in politics, what's going on now, with a big fascist march. Who knew we would go back to that? And people sort of making out of Hitler a hero. It's complex. Again, if I had some bomb drop and people dying and whatever, that'd be the obvious. But no. What wasn't obvious was the fact that the mechanics of what they were working with, again, it's very strange. It's much more interesting, much more complex, much more fascinating, much more. Again, this is not a propaganda picture. This is a picture which is about, who we are, rather than like you already said yourselves, who we like to think we are.
A section of the film that I find fascinating is George's kind of adoption almost by the criminals, the sort of Stephen Graham section of the movie. It's almost kind of Pinocchio-esque in terms of like that. I forget, is it like Pleasure Island? I forget the name of the dark sort of second act of that film, but there's this kind of like darkness that then pervades the film, and it's a darkness on both sides, in that you have these criminals who are robbing the sort of lifeless bodies of the upper class in this, who died of a bomb exploding. I think their lungs exploded as the result of this bomb exploding. I had no idea. I had to Google that. That was really interesting to me. But yeah, there's darkness on both sides in that, like, these elites, despite the suffering, despite the war that's going on, they're, sipping champagne and having this elegant evening. And of course, there's darkness in terms of these opportunistic criminals who very much go against the myth that we've been discussing throughout this conversation of, like, British togetherness. Can you tell me about the construction of this segment of the film and why it was important?
Well, as well as the light, you have to talk about the darkness as well. I mean, that's the reality of war. Criminality, poverty, necessity. Again, that one could drag it. Again, he could be dragged into this situation. This is a makeup of, again, you have a situation. You have a group of a gang which is made up of Chinese, mixed race people like Stephen Graham, and the woman and someone of Greek heritage. Again, it's London. It's really London in that way, and they could just bring along this child with them to sort of use again. George was there for us to see what was, helping us to see what was going on during that time too, and again, we know that the George Graham character has some kind of, obviously, some abusive past when he hits himself in front of George and say, "Does it hurt? Does it hurt?" Obviously, that has something to obviously do his own childhood or background. In a way, there's always people who are walking around who are sort of walking wounded, as it were. So again, there's a complexity to that too. Look, I love the idea of with the Cafe Barry. It's all about life. Even the song that is being sung in that scene, "Oh Johnny," which is about orgasm. Oh Johnny, again, listen to the lyrics. It's about orgasm. The whole song is about life. And minutes later, it's about death and the aftermath of that. And that song was actually being played at the same time as when the bomb dropped. That actually happened when they were singing Johnny. That's again, and then again, you said before, openly gay black man, Snake Johnson in the club. Again, it was very, it was very sort of, it was very sort of, the people living to, dressed in lines and, they're living the life of Riley. Again, the perversity of that, people sort of living off rations, but people eating oysters and so forth and whatnot. So when lights are turned on, when you see the flip side of that, the sort of limbo as such, because at some point, you have living in the dead, the criminal going through the wreckage and sort of, cutting fingers off for jewelry. And also George being witness to this. So that, George having the first time being, sort of witnessing sort of a certain sense of his own, not necessarily his own, but seeing death for the first time, and people playing with the dead, the living and the dead, the perversity of that. Again, it's very, again, these are scenes, these are scenes, this is not light in a way at all, far from it. And of course, when you see a child seeing all this, there's a heaviness to it. And I want to be very confrontational in that way too. Again, there's good and bad about war, and you can't neglect that. And again, these are images. Like I said, for me, I'm interested in, particularly revolutionary images, which these images have never been seen before. All the images in this picture have never been seen before. Never. Well, that's what it is. And again, you're using a conventional, in a way, traditional, so in quotations, way of doing things to do something completely different.
And in terms of other images that we haven't seen before, I mean, I couldn't even begin to estimate.
Or a narrative, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, in terms of these things that have not been sort of shown, they've not been depicted in cinema before. We've had like a litany. We've had like endless World War II films, but I don't think I've seen a film do an equivalent to the scene with the flood in the tube station. And the claustrophobia of that scene, the panic of that scene as it sets in, thinking you're safe in this refuge only to sort of like all of a sudden sort of be perilously close to drowning. Can you tell me about like, yeah, the inspiration for that scene, whether that came from real life, and yeah, the execution of it, because it's so kind of pulse racing. And yeah, I had a call from my editor on the way back from seeing the film, and he was like, "Are you walking?" And I was like, "Have you seen Blitz? There's no way I'm getting on the tube after immediately watching that particular scene." So yeah, Steve, tell me about the construction of this moment.
Well, the setup, say from day one, and our picture is that the only place to be safe is in the underground. That's the setup. People fighting their way to get in the underground. So the whole idea of being safe is to be, in sheltering in flood comes. It's the biggest shock in the world. Again, because we built this up, and again, as far as writing a script is concerned, and laying the bed for that scene, I was very happy with the fact that we did that. And then of course the actual what actually happened, that's actually happened. What happened, there was a bomb that dropped, and it a huge crater, bus fell into it. It burst a sewage pipe and a water pipe, and it flooded the underground. And in fact, as you see in the movie, people were drowning, people taking down the tube or whatever. And it flooded the thing, and it was a 9-year-old boy, funny enough, again, who saved the day. And we obviously made George that night. And unfortunately, that gentleman died 8 years ago, who actually, the 9-year-old boy who actually saved people's lives. So that actually happened. That we put George being a 9-year-old boy who saved people's life, but further lives that would have been taken. And what happened was they blocked up the subway station, and they tunneled around it. So there are still people to this day buried.
I should ask as well, Steve, about the ending. Not so much in terms of what happens, but in terms of the tone with which you treat that scene. Like, so obviously, like the reunion that George and Rita both crave, we have a coming together of those magnets, as you've described them, and that, in a sense, is a triumph. But we also have like the death of George's grandfather. Clifford Lane is blown to bits, and there is this kind of bittersweet note. It's not played as pure triumph because war still persists, and the credits are about to roll, but we don't know if what kind of peril is going to strike these characters the next day. Can you tell me about what was important when it came to this ending and the tone you wanted to strike?
At the end of the picture, Gerald in some ways had to die. There has to be personal loss in this situation, that because it has to hit home, it has to be real. And again, that's why it was very important that Paul Weller's character had this gravitas, even though he was in it for such a short period of time. But we felt him, and we felt that love, and we felt that care, and that there was that weight. So when we do lose him, you do feel it, and you do feel the emotion on George's face. Elliot was just extraordinary at that moment with the close up. And he had lost someone, unfortunately. In fact, Elliot had just lost someone in his family recently, so he was channeling all of that stuff. And the kid was extraordinary. So therefore, that was real. So the whole idea of that reunion was great. But again, it just says so much. I mean, what was going on? You could think of Dresden, you could think of Coventry, you could think of all of these cities that were obliterated during the Second World War. So when we pull out, as when George and Rita finally find each other, and then what happens is that you have all of these, as we pull out, what happens is the workers dissolve to nothing, and we just left with Rita and George. Well, when we pull out, this could be Lebanon, this could be somewhere, this could be Palestine, this could be anywhere in the world where there's people dropping bombs, Ukraine. This could be anywhere. It's indicative of anywhere in the world right now. So that was the idea, that it's, of course, it is what it is. It's London there. It could be anywhere. And therefore, when right at the end of the picture, when George comes around again, and we repeat that sort of phrase that happened at the beginning of the picture about the wish, and we cut to the daisies. The daisies are nostalgia, how things were or how things could be, or how things we would like them to be. Because at the end of the day, it is in our hands. I mean, look, is it likely? I don't know, but there is chance for peace. Again, the movie, you could start the movie, the movie could be a loop. You could start it from those flowers at the end of the picture, cut straight into guys sort of with fire hoses fighting a fire. It could be a loop, because in some ways it is. This whole narrative is a loop. It's ongoing. And again, of course, this movie could come out at any time, but as I said before, with the world on fire as it is, it feels so necessary for now. So again, there's, yeah, unfortunately, there's this kind of it's kind of classic in the sense of way, because unfortunately we keep on making the same mistake. And we try, one is trying to break the circle. That's what I'm trying to do as an artist. And what I'm trying to say is this: how we in general see war is through the media. How we engage with war, majority of us engage with war, is through a graphic image. You know, if it's either computer on your computer screen or television or newspaper or whatever, however you receive your media, it's graphic, it's abstract. I was in a war zone in 2003. I was a war artist. Bizarrely enough, there's such a thing called war artist in UK. I was in Iraq, and I remember that. In fact, I think that's the seed of Blitz. And I remember being with the troops, you know, from the UK. They were from Edinburgh, Swansea, Hull, Newcastle, you know, Southampton, you know, everywhere, Manchester, Liverpool, whatever there was, these regional accents. And I was with the guys, and I was doing tours of duty, I was doing all kinds of stuff, helicopters going out to oil fields and whatnot. And I remember feeling a real sense of camaraderie, a real sense of nationalism for the first time, actually, you know, being British, as it were. And what was so weird about it, it was happening through war. That was the perversity of it. It was totally, utterly perverse. I had this nationality or this feeling of unity through war. And I imagine it's because when you think you're going to die, or not even going to die, but there's a sense of way of it. You come together because of it. There's a certain sense of, you know, them and us. And I wanted to explore that through Blitz. And I think that the last image in the picture, you know, last images is somehow of hope. Because I said before, the reason why I want to make Blitz is to make it not abstract. I thought to do something dramatic, to bring war home, as it were. Say, look, this happened here, would hopefully, allow people to engage more in what's going on elsewhere.
I'll end with this question, Steve, as you've been so generous with your time. The film ends with the words, "Make a wish." And I'm curious if you got one wish as to what audiences would take away from Blitz, the knock-on effect of this film, the way that other films of yours, other work of yours has had this tangible effect. What would be your wish?
Well, listen, as a filmmaker, I've always wanted my films to go beyond the screen. I love film. I love it. I'm excited about what dynamics of film is exciting. But for me, as who I am as a person, I would say as a Black artist, for me, and how I see things, you know, I see things in all, you know, aspects, you know, through a white lens or through a Black lens. I see things in a way, maybe certain things people, don't have that, you know, don't have that perspective, consciously or unconsciously. You know, one can, I suppose, and people do. I have to have a situation with my work that for me, it has to go beyond the frame. It has to go beyond the frame, for me at least. I would try to make something that goes beyond the frame, is appreciated by audiences or whatever, in cinema or whatever, but it can actually have hopefully a wider, broader conversation. Hopefully. You know, that's always my wish in one way, shape, form. If it's to do with, you know, Bobby Sands and hunger strike, because sometimes art can be an actual object that can actually test the temperature or measure the situation of how far we've come. I mean, I remember with hunger, when we presented the picture in Belfast, I mean, people were hiding under tables and behind couches to see, oh my God, what's going to happen with this situation when it's released in Belfast or whatever. Bodyguards and all that business. And you know what happened? Nothing happened. And the reason why nothing happened, because the movie was the measure of how things had developed within the conversation. Similarly to, say, sex addiction with shame, and absolutely with 12 Years a Slave. I mean, there wasn't really a conversation going on about slavery that I remember, because when I decided to make a picture about slavery, I thought it was like tone deaf. And then from that, I mean, so many things happened because of 12 Years a Slave. You know, as I said before, I mean, movies were made, Black filmmakers were allowed to make their movies because of the box office, because it became it became a blockbuster. Who bloody knew? And conversations and articles and people reportage, and you know, it allowed people to talk about so many things which were related to slavery, which was the evidence of which was all around us. So again, you know, listen, film and art is one thing. I think that to get a situation where the power of cinema is really effective. That's why I'm in cinema, because there's a power to it that can actually have a far broad, wider effect than most things within the arts. And again, I just love that situation when one can have a voice within, however small, that you can have your hands on the steering wheel a little bit. So that will be my wish.
That's a beautiful wish and a beautiful note to end this conversation on. Steve, thank you so much for this film and for this conversation. It's been such a delight chatting with you today.
Well, it's been an honor. Thank you, mate. Take care. All the best.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.